Okay, so you can all see that, I hope, and hear me. So,
Yes.
great. So, why study moths? Well, here's two good reasons. Now, your pictures are blocking part of this quote, so it's a little, if I mess up here. First quote is, human knowledge shall be erased from the archives of something before we possess the last word that the gnat has to say to us. This is from the famous French entomologist Jean-Henri Fabre, who I admire greatly. And what he's saying here is that the insect world is so complex and so diverse that no matter how long the human race studies it, we will never come to the end of things we need to learn. And that is certainly true. So there's a huge amount to learn by studying insects of all types, and for that matter, all living organisms. And we have the
Ron,
world is full of magic things, patiently waiting for our senses to grow sharper. That's from William Butler Yeats, the famous poet. So he's saying that the world is full of beautiful and wonderful things, and that certainly includes the living world. And so those are two reasons to study moths. So those are two good reasons to study moths. There's another reason that isn't so pleasant to talk about, but now I can't get this to move. There we go. So as you may have heard over the last 10 years or so, especially over the last 5 years, uh, there's what some are calling the insect apocalypse has been discovered. This actually doesn't apply just to insects. It also applies to all arthropods, so spiders, centipedes, etc. So there's been a bunch of scientific studies that have come out, especially over the last 4 years, suggesting that human behavior on the planet is wiping out insects severely. So populations are dropping anywhere from 15 to 50 to 60% of what they were 20 years ago, depending on who you listen to or what study you look at. And this is a really bad thing to have happen, since famous Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson said rightly that insects are the little things that run the world. So if the insects go, we're going to go with them. Mostly this is caused by habitat fragmentation, but also by climate change. So we need to study these things while they're around. We're losing species like crazy, and each species has something to teach us, probably lots of things that we need to know. Okay, so let's move on to some basic biology. So we're going to talk about the order Lepidoptera, which is derived from, the name is derived from the ancient Greek lepis, meaning scale, and pteron, meaning wing. So scales are one of the prominent features of Lepidoptera, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Thus far, there are roughly 160,000 described species. This is worldwide, Lepidoptera, that's of 2011. This is the largest lineage of plant-feeding organisms on the planet. It's a sister group to what are called the Trichoptera. These are caddisflies, whose larvae live in little encased houses underwater. There was a large radiation of Lepidoptera about 100 million years ago during the middle of the Cretaceous, which was the same time that the flowering plants were appearing. They are one of the most studied and monographed insect orders. And one reason for that is that in the Lepidoptera, there's a large number of insect pests that attack agricultural crops. Continuing with our analysis here, so we can point out that the second largest group of insects, as you may know, after the Lepidoptera, there's huge numbers, are the beetles, the Coleoptera. And you can divide Lepidoptera into two groups. These are not so much taxonomic categories as broader categories. So they're Microlepidoptera, and these are the primitive moth lineages, up to and including a group of moths called pyraloids. The larvae of all of these are internal feeders. And this group has a large number of families in it, but a minority of species. The Macrolepidoptera are the more advanced moths, and these include a series of superfamilies, some of which we're going to talk about, all of these we're going to talk about: Lasiocompoidea, Bombicoidea, Geometroidea, and Noctuoidea. The larvae in the Macrolepidoptera are all external feeders, so they're visible if you're walking around in a forest and you're looking at leaves and other surfaces. And the macros have the majority of species, but the minority of families. Now, this next slide, don't be troubled by this. Oops. We're going to talk about biological classification, then I'm going to show you a phylogeny. So this is a review. Start with the domain, go to a kingdom, a phylum, class. Here's order. This is where Lepidoptera are. And then in zoology, unlike botany, there are so many species and the complexity is so high that we have to use superfamilies as well as families. So superfamilies are indicated by the suffix OIDEA, families by IDEA. Then we go to a genus and species. The species epithet is the specific name. It's treated as Latin. It is Latin, italicized. And the species corresponds to the binomial genus, species, and then the author's name or names of the people who, this keeps going backward, who specified that that particular organism had that name. So Allocapnia sasquatchi is the genus, the species, and here are the two authors that designated that species. Okay, so don't worry too much about the complexities of this slide. You can ignore most of it. But this is a phylogenetic tree. It's an old one, so there have been some changes, but this helps to illustrate the points I was making a moment ago. So all of these are superfamilies. Notice the ending, OIDEA. So all of these, all the way down to here, are microlepidopteran superfamilies. The Paraloidea are sort of sometimes considered to be intermediate between microleps and macroleps, but for our purposes, we'll put them with the microleps. So 35% of the species diversity in Lepidoptera is in all of these different families. 70% of the family diversity is in these different superfamilies. Down here, you have the macroleps, Macrolepidoptera. These have 65% of the species diversity and 25% of the family diversity. And buried in here, there are two superfamilies, Hesperioidea and Papilionoidea. These are the two superfamilies that contain all of the butterflies in here. And Heteloidea is sort of intermediate. It's been classified as a butterfly superfamily and as a moth superfamily. Currently, it's lumped in with the moths, but we don't know how long that's going to last. But anyway, all of our butterflies are in here, and we're not going to talk about those. Most people are fairly familiar with butterflies, so we'll talk only about moths. And we're going to have to use Latin names because most moths, being nocturnal, are unknown to most people, and there are no common names generally, except for some of the more conspicuous ones. So let's briefly review the life cycle of a lepidopteran. They undergo complete metamorphosis. So they have 4 distinct stages: the egg, the larva or the caterpillar, the pupa, and the adult. And then the cycle repeats. The larval food consists mostly of vegetable matter, leaves, but also flowers, dead vegetable matter, stems, internal parts of woody plants. And then some of the moths have rather exotic food habits. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that. Here's an illustration of a caterpillar to give you some idea of the nomenclature, because we'll refer to some of this later. So there's a head, then there's a thorax that consists of 3 thoracic segments: the prothorax, the mesothorax, and the metathorax. And on these 3 thoracic segments, you have 3 pairs of true legs, here, here, and here. Then you have 10 abdominal segments, A1 through A10, as they're marked here. And on abdominal segments 3, 4, 5, and 6, you have 4 pairs of prolegs. These are different in structure than the true legs. That you can see they're a bit fatter, and the pads on the bottom of these are a little different. And there's also a pair of prolegs all the way here on the end, at the terminal end of the caterpillar. So there's a total of 5 pairs of prolegs. 4 on abdominal segments 3 to 6, 1 on the anal segment. You can also see the breathing holes here, the spiracles here, 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 etc. And also there's one here. These are how the caterpillar absorbs oxygen from the air. Now here's a cartoon of an adult moth or butterfly. So they have antennae, they have a compound eye, they have palpi, we won't get into those very much. They have a proboscis. The proboscis is also called the haustellium, or haustellum rather. You'll see that on some of the slides. It's a really remarkable evolutionary invention. It's not just a hollow straw, but it consists of two semicircular pieces which are stitched together by sort of little prongs that hold it together. It's flexible, so it can be rolled up or it can be stretched out. It can be bent in the middle. It's a really amazing organ. And then you have the head, the thorax with the three true legs, pairs of three true legs attached, and the abdomen. And then, of course, a forewing and a hind wing. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, one of the remarkable things about Lepidoptera are the scales. So these are found in butterflies and moths, both. They are modified hairs. And as you are obviously aware, or surely aware, they come in various colors. They also come in various shapes and dimensions and thicknesses and other sorts of things. So this is an electron scanning micrograph at low magnification. We can bring this up. You can see there's more detail. Bring it up further to 1,000 magnification. There's even more detail. Bring it up to 5,000. And there's all this microstructure in here. So this 5 micron scale here, to give you some idea, a human blood cell is somewhere between 5 microns to 10 microns in diameter. So all of this minute detail you're seeing here is much smaller than a human blood cell. Now, the scales fulfill a whole bunch of important functions. They're insulation on the wings. They are aerodynamically important. That is, they control the airflow over the surface of the wings. They also, since they're colored, allow patterns on the wings that can be used for communication, like some moths and butterflies. In the case of butterflies, the monarch that has the red and black pattern, that's a warning indicating that the monarch butterfly is full of poisonous materials that the caterpillar sequesters from milkweed plants. So birds, which are a major predator of butterflies, learn that pattern fairly early on, and they avoid them, avoid the monarchs ever since. And there are lots of butterflies who have warning patterns, lots of moths that have warning patterns. And recently, very interesting paper was published just end of last year on moth scales, something totally new. A group of acoustical engineers looked at moths and butterflies, and we'll talk about this a bit more later, but moths have ears, but not all moths have ears. And the reason moths have ears is because moths are mostly nocturnal, and their major predator at night is bats. And bats use echolocation to find moths that are flying. So the moths, some of them, have developed ears so they can hear the bats coming. The ears are called tympanum or tympana, and they are basically a pit with a membrane spread across the front or the top, which has nerves attached to it. When bat signals hit the membrane vibrates, sends a signal, and the moth hears the bat. So moths have a way of responding to this. So one way of doing this is that the moth drops to the ground immediately. Another way is that the moth sends an ultrasonic signal back to the bat so the bat can hear it, and it's a unique signal depending on the species of moth, and if the moth will say something like, I'm toxic, don't try to eat me. So the bats, just like the birds, learn after a few trials which signals indicate that the moth shouldn't be eaten because it tastes bad or it's poisonous. And then there's a third response from some moths. You'll see one later. I'll point it out when we get to it. What they do is jam the bat's radar. They send out a 120 decibel signal that totally overwhelms the signal of the bat, so the bat loses track of the moth. So all that has been known for about 10 years. So what was discovered recently is if you look at butterflies which do not have ears, and you look at moths which do not have ears, you'll find there's a difference in the scales on the butterflies and on those moth scales. The moths that do not have ears have scales that absorb the signals from the bats. So this is stealth technology long before fighter planes ever had stealth technology. So moths that have ears have ways of dealing with bats because they can hear them. Moths that don't have ears have devised a strategy which makes them invisible to the echolocation technology that the bats try to employ. So there's always something new to learn. So now let's move on to some major moth superfamilies that you will see in New Mexico. These are all from the Gila region, so some of them may not be present in northern New Mexico. Lasiocampoidea. There's only one family in this superfamily. Worldwide, there are 224 genera, and there's almost 2,000 species. These are the 10 caterpillars. You've probably seen this kind of nest, collective nest, in trees. So they house themselves together, and they come out at night, but during the day, they spend their time here in this protective enclosure, protected from birds. These moths are variable in size. They're frequently sexually dimorphic. That means that the male and the female can look different from one another. They're mostly nocturnal. They have a triangular forewing, usually with a rounded margin. They have short antennae, which are usually plumose in the male. That means plumose means feathery. The haustellum or the proboscis is either reduced or absent. That means the adults probably do not feed mostly. Only the caterpillars feed. The head is somewhat small and concealed. And you see some examples here. Here's a caterpillar. Here's a Malacosoma. I'll show you one in a moment. And here's Glovaria arizonensis, which you'll see coming up. So all the pictures I'm showing you are from my moth website, which is at southwesternmoths.com. And on that website, there's over 600 photos of species of moths from the Gila region at this point, still ongoing. So this is Malacosoma incurva. This is what's called the Hodges number. In 1983, a famous lepidopterist named Ronald Hodges created a checklist for all the moth species in North America. And he put them in by phylogenetic classification into a list. It's now outdated, but it's useful. The numbering system is useful still. So here's the species, here's the family, here's the size. The wingspan here is 31 millimeters. If you're metrically challenged, 25 millimeters is approximately 1 inch. So the span across this moth is a bit larger than 1 inch. It happens to be a male, and here's the location and the date of collection. And in this case, the larval food plant is known. It's cottonwoods and willows. And this one has a name because it's such a pest. It's the southwestern tent caterpillar moth. Here's another Lasiocampid, Glovaria arizonensis. This is a big moth, wingspan of 90 millimeters. This is a female from the Big Burro Mountains in Grant County, which is where I live in southern New Mexico. This guy feeds on junipers and cypress and on pine trees. And the caterpillar is really quite beautiful. This was taken outside my door on alligator juniper. The head is down here and the tail is over here. Unlike most juniper caterpillars, this guy is pretty bright and easy to see. He's also big. This one's 26 millimeters. I forgot to mention that both butterfly and moth caterpillars go through molts while they're feeding. They get too big and they have to shed their skin. Those molts are called instars, and typically they're are 5 to 6 instars, depends on the species. And the length of time, the length of time that it spends as a caterpillar can range from a couple of weeks for a very small caterpillar to months for larger caterpillars. So this is a really pretty little caterpillar. Let's move on, Bombicoidea. So this superfamily has a bunch of families in it that we don't see in the temperate regions. But there's 3 here that we're going to talk about. Apatolotidae, small family, 10 genera, 145 species. Saturniidae, 169 genera, 2,349 species. And Sthingidae, 206 genera, roughly 1,500 species. So let's look at Apatolotidae. These are the American silk moths. They're medium-sized, they're nocturnal. They have an unusual wing shape. You can see this here, or see this here, or here. They have short antennae. They have almost no proboscis. The adults don't feed. Larvae are densely hairy and they feed externally. Here's a picture of a larva. It's a pretty interesting looking caterpillar. In general, caterpillars of Macrolepidoptera are very interesting and sometimes crazy looking. Here's our most common species in this area, Apatolotes putefacta. This one has a wingspan of about 41 millimeters. This was a male, and this was collected where I live in the Big Burro Mountains. It feeds on seep willow. Okay, let's move on to the hawk moths, the Sphingidae. Hawk moths, hornworms, hummingbird moths. You've undoubtedly seen some of these moths. They have a kind of, some people say, jet aircraft-like shape. They're extremely good flyers. They hover just like hummingbirds. They can fly backwards. They're mostly nocturnal. They have antennae that are thick and sometimes swollen at the end. They have a very long proboscis, some of them, because some of them feed on flowers that are very long and tubular. In our area, we have a flower that is very long and tubular, whose name, I'm having a senior moment, you've probably seen it. It's in the Nyctaginaceae. It's Mirabilis longiflora, it came to me, yes. Long white flower with blue exerted stamens. The flower is like as long as 3 inches or so. And there's a hawk moth that has a proboscis that's long enough to reach the bottom of that flower and get to the nectar. So another feature of the Sphingidae hawk moths, they're called hornworms because the rear end of the caterpillar, or the caudal end, has a caudal horn on it. It's not always there, and it varies in size. Sometimes it's large, sometimes it's small. The pupae have an unusual feature in that the proboscis is separate. You can see it here. It's not fused to the rest of the body of the pupae. It actually has its own little casing here. And some of these Sphingidae, the hawk moths, are pests of tomatoes, potatoes, tobacco, sweet potato. So we'll see a picture in a moment of one of those pest Sphingidae. And here's the most famous caterpillar in the world, probably, which is a sphingid. This is Hemeroplanes triptolemus. We don't have this in the temperate region. This is tropical. But this caterpillar, when disturbed, here's the top of the caterpillar. This is the top of the head. It lifts up its head area, flips over the head. This is the underside of the head. And it looks exactly like a venomous snake. It's incredible, the mimicry here. And it also sways from side to side, sways its so-called head here from side to side. So it really looks like a viper that's getting ready to attack. And it's very effective. I'm told that people who find this in the tropical rainforest are afraid to touch it because it looks so dangerous when, of course, it's actually harmless. So I really hope I get to see one of these guys someday. Here's 2 more caterpillars, again with the caudal horns. And then this one illustrates a common problem for all caterpillars. These are the eggs of a parasite. So for macroleps, which are external, there's a huge amount of parasitism on the caterpillars. And it's generally either flies, tachinid flies, or parasitic wasps. The flies tend to lay their eggs on the surface of the caterpillar. The wasps tend to use an ovipositor to deposit the egg inside the caterpillar. And then usually the egg, internal one anyway, waits until the caterpillar is molted and gotten bigger and bigger until it's almost ready to pupate before the egg hatches, and then there's a lot of caterpillar to eat at that point. It then consumes the entire inside of the caterpillar. Fairly grisly, but that's life. So let me show you some common sphinges. This is an extremely common one, the white-lined sphinx. This feeds on Portulaca, mirabilis, and epilobium. It's pretty big. The wingspan here was almost 70 millimeters. And if you follow flying things at all, you've probably seen the white-lined sphinx before. This one you may not have seen, Sphinx dali. Its larva feeds on Juniperus depiana, which is alligator juniper, and other junipers. And the reason I show this adult is because I wanted to show you the caterpillar, which is this amazing creature that is heavily camouflaged on juniper. Here's the caudal horn. It's quite thick in this case. But this green and white pattern makes it extremely hard to see this caterpillar, even though it gets quite large. This one, when I took the photograph, was about 1.25 inches long. So it's big, but I challenge you to find it on a juniper bush or a juniper tree. It's extremely difficult. When you're looking for things like this, the way you usually do it is you use a beat sheet. That's a square piece of canvas on a wooden frame that you hold under the branch of some plant. And then you take something like a baseball bat and you whack the branch a couple of times quickly, and the caterpillars and other things will fall off onto the canvas, and then you can sort through what you have. And quite often you find really interesting things. It's a fun way to spend an afternoon. So here's another sphingid, a beautiful one from the Big Burro Mountains. It feeds on cottonwoods and willows. So I found this one near a stream in the Big Burro Mountains. It's pretty big, 65 millimeters. This is probably a male. Notice the antennae. In many moths, the male antennae are thicker and plumose or feathery compared to the moths, the female moths, which usually have slender antennae. But like all things in moths, that rule is sometimes broken. Now here's an especially interesting sphingid. This is a diurnal moth that flies during the daytime. This was collected using a net on Monarda fistulosa, which is a beautiful member of the mint family that gets quite tall. And it's a bumblebee mimic. And it flies like a bumblebee. It hovers in a slow sort of way, moving slowly from one flower to another. And if you don't look closely, you'll think you're looking at a bumblebee. Now, the wings are clear, which is really interesting. The way this works is when the moth emerges from the pupae, these wings are covered with scales. But as soon as it starts to vibrate its wings, those scales all fall off, leaving clear portions. So that's another really interesting evolutionary adaptation. And here's finally one of the pests, Manduca quinquam maculata. This is the tomato hornworm moth. It also eats tobacco, potato, and just about anything else in Solanaceae. So this is a big moth, 115 millimeters across. It's a male, so it's over 4 inches across, almost 5 inches across. And the caterpillar, if you've seen tomato hornworms, you know that they're actually quite big. Okay, let's move along. So Saturniidae, these are our giant silk moths. These are the biggest moths we have in New Mexico. They have big, fat, spiny larvae or hairy larvae. And some of these hairy larvae are actually quite dangerous. So here's an example of what you can run into, and try not to. If you see a larva that looks, or a caterpillar that looks like this with these forked spines on it, never ever pick it up. You'll regret it if you do, because these spines are loaded with a poisonous toxin, and they hurt like crazy if you touch them. Some species are so bad, this is mostly in the tropics, some of the species in the tropics will actually send you to the hospital, and people have died from the venom that's in the spine. So they're not something you want to mess with. The pupae are short and fat. They're either leathery like this, or they're in this kind of papery cocoon. These are large moths. A few are diurnal. They have broad triangular forewings. A frenulum is a hook that's attached to the hind wing that hooks it to the forewing, but for some reason the Saturniidae don't have that. They have a fold that's used, two folds that hook together. Many of the Saturniids have an eye spot. You can see that here. And when they're resting, the ones with the eye spot quite often move the forewings in the resting position over these eye spots. But if you poke this moth that's sitting on a sheet at a UV light, it will move the forewings forward and expose these eye spots. So the name of the game here is, this is some pair of eyes staring at you if you're a bird, and it's supposed to scare you off, and it does work. It's employed by a lot of moths. These usually have short antennae, and there can be really plumose in the male, that is feathery. The adults have no proboscis, so they can't feed. They don't live very long, less than 7 days. Usually the female puts out a pheromone, and the male usually finds the female as it's emerging from the pupa and mates with it almost on emergence. So the female then has nothing to do for 6 days or so while it starves to death. Here's one of our most beautiful ones. This is, I think, my favorite. Citheronia splendens sinaloensis. This is a big moth, 110 millimeters across, over 4 inches. This is a male. You can see the feathery antennae. It feeds on cotton, manzanita, and sumac. These aren't very common, but when they show up, they're really impressive. Here's one called Sphingicampa hubbardi. Wingspan is about 2 inches. This is a male. It feeds on acacia, mesquite, and paloverdi. Colorado Pandora rather, 70 millimeters across. This guy can be really abundant. It feeds on pines, and in pine groves in the late summer, there can be literally hundreds and hundreds of these. I've seen that happen. Lots of dead ones lying on the ground. And the larvae can be incredibly abundant. And so the Paiute Indians actually ate the larvae. They had to roast them and then boil them first. They apparently weren't very tasty, but they were edible after being roasted and boiled. And see how feathery the antennae are? That's an indication you have a male. Automeris cecrops, there's a bunch of automeris. The forewings usually look sort of like a leaf. Some look, in the tropics, look exactly like a leaf. This is a female, probably. Here's these big eye spots, but when this guy is in the resting position, this has been spread, these eye spots are covered. But if you poke the moth that's sitting on the sheet, it won't fly away. Usually the first thing it does is move these forewings up and expose these big eye spots. So it feeds on mountain mahogany, mimosa, and oaks. It's 91 millimeters in this case across. And this is even bigger, Antharea oculea. This is a female. Again, notice the beautiful eye spots. In this case, they're also present on the forewing. And this species is not very common, but it feeds on quercus, on oak, and on walnut. And finally, in this group, Hyalophora gloveri. It's also really big, 124 millimeters across, 5 inches. It's on Ceanothus and on Manzanita. Well, usually if these are on a sheet, if you have a UV light, they're very sluggish. Unlike some of the smaller moths, if you try and touch the smaller moths, they fly away immediately. But these huge moths just sit there. They don't fly away. They're very sluggish. So you can get a good look at them. Okay, so we'll go on to the Geometroidea. And we're only going to talk about, in this superfamily, the Geometridae. These other groups are tropical, and there's some gorgeous moths in these groups. We don't have them here, alas, but we have Geometridae, which is the biggest, probably the biggest family in the macrolepts, the biggest family of moths there is. 23,000 species worldwide. So there's a lot of these guys. So geometers, they're called, or inchworms, and some are green, and they're called emeralds. It's a large, very diverse family. It's mostly nocturnal. There's a triangular forewing, and the pattern frequently extends into the hind wing. So see that here? Here, and here. So that's very characteristic. And they splay the wings out like this. Not all of them. This one didn't, or doesn't. But quite often, you can see both the forewing and the hind wing splayed out when they're resting. And the pattern extends from the forewing to the hind wing. So you see that, it's a geometry. Moderately long antennae, frequently plumose in the male, and they have an abdominal tympanum. So their ears are located on the abdomen. The ears on different kinds of moths are not in the same place. They're called inchworms for the following reason. So they have 3 pairs of true legs, here, here, and here, you can see that, but they're missing prolegs on A3, A4, and A5, producing a gap in prolegs. And so they can't walk like a normal caterpillar. They walk this way. They bring their rear end up to the front, and they move their front end forward, pick up their rear end, and move it forward. So they're called inchworms. Some of them are really strange. This one looks exactly like a twig. And that's not uncommon among caterpillars. A lot of caterpillars are camouflaged, not just geos, but others. They're pests of many crops, ornamental plants, forest trees. They can defoliate entire trees under outbreak conditions. Here's some local ones. Macaria ponderosi. It's 30 millimeters across. It's a male. We don't know what the food plant is. It's an Aporpia macdonii, 38 millimeters across, a male. Probably the food plant is in the pine family, but we're not sure. Snowia montaneria, 41 millimeters across. We don't know what the food plant is. For so many moths, we have no idea what the caterpillar looks like, and we don't know what the food plant is. Here's a really pretty one, super pretty, Stamnodes furofactaria. This is a smaller moth. Food plant is unknown. And these moths, a lot of geos, as I mentioned, rest with their wings spread out. But in the group, subgroup that Stamnodes is in, these moths rest with their wings folded over their abdomen. So straight up, vertical. And so this is the top side. The underside is strongly marked because when the moth is resting, that's the part that's visible. This is true in a lot of butterflies as well, which rest with their wings straight up. Not all butterflies do, but a good number do rest with their wings held vertically. There may also be something going on here, we're not sure, Since we don't know what the food plant is, this orange color could indicate that this moth is toxic. Orange quite often indicates toxicity to frighten off birds. So if we knew what the food plant was, we could be a better judge of that, because then we would know what the plant chemistry is. Here's an emerald, Nemoria obliqua. There's about maybe 20 species of emeralds in North America, 25 or more. The green color is not stable, unlike most moth colors, which are pretty stable. So if you collect one of these, pin it and spread it, and then it dries out, the green color will fade. This feeds on Rus trilobata. And here's one just to show that in all moth, rules are broken, or can be mostly. Here's a geometrid. It's a very pretty geometrid, but it doesn't look much like a geometrid. It doesn't extend the forewing pattern to the hindwing pattern. And you can't tell because this is spread, but if in the resting position, this moth holds its forewings over its hindwings. So any rule you can make up about a group of moths, you'll probably find one that breaks the rule. Okay, so now we'll talk about Noctuoidea. In here, we're going to talk about three families: Notodontidae, Erebidae, and Noctuidae. Notodontidae is a fairly small group, 3,800 species worldwide. Erebidae is huge, 25,000 species worldwide. Noctuidae is quite large, almost 12,000 species worldwide. So here's a notodontid. Here's something in the Erebidae, Noctuidae. Notodontids are called prominents. The reason they're called prominents is because some of them, adults, show this hump on the head. The mouth parts are usually reduced. The male antennae are quite frequently plumose at the base, but then they get just hairy at the end. There's a metathoracic tympanum, so it's on the metathorax, not the abdomen. There's a long triangular forewing. Here's some examples. The prominents are external foliage feeders, but they're rarely pests. The weird thing about prominents, or the most interesting thing in terms of appearance, are the caterpillars. The caterpillars are often really crazy looking. A lot of them are missing the A10 prolegs. So they tend to hold their rear end up. And for reasons that aren't clear, a lot of them also hold their front end up. So when they're resting, they make a U with both the head and the tail sticking up in the air. Nobody seems to know why that's true. And they are quite exotic, some of them. This is the head of this caterpillar. This is the tail. It's got these weird tails on it. This is the head. It's got these weird horn-like things on it. It's not clear what the function of that is. Anyway, notodontid caterpillars are really interesting looking. Here's an adult, Eosia ramosa. It's one of the prettier ones, I think. It's not too big, 2 inches across. This was a male. You can see the feathery antennae, and it feeds on cottonwoods and willows. Titania integerrima, about 2 inches across, feeds on walnut. In our area, we don't have Korea here. That's pecans, but we do have plenty of walnuts. It's a male again. If you look at this under a microscope, you see that these antennae are quite feathery. Okay, now let's talk about a bigger group. The Erebidae have a lot of different kinds of moth in them. And they're highly variable in appearance. So you have what are called underwings, tiger moths, woolly bears are the caterpillars, tussock moths, and a variety of others. You can see here, they look quite different in appearance. The caterpillars, here's a woolly bear. These are sometimes black. So the arctiines, or the tiger moths, are all toxic, both as the caterpillar and as the adult. And they have really furry, crazy looking caterpillars. This is an arctine as well. See the bright orange and black. This is a tiger moth. So let's look at some of these in particular. So the underwings, the catocala, uh, used to be in noctuity, are a favorite with collectors. Uh, Tiger moths are also a favorite with collectors because they are so beautiful, so many of them. Lymantriidae, the tussock moths are interesting. We're not going to talk about them just because we don't have enough time to cover everything. So here's a catocala Delilah. So all of the underwings have hind wings that are marked strikingly with orange and black, but the pattern varies with the moth. Some of them have white and black rather than orange and black. But when they're in the resting position, the forewings completely cover the hind wings. So this is not visible. This one is about 2 inches across and it feeds on oaks. So what's going on here is a couple of things. It may be toxic, but probably not because it feeds on oaks, which is not loaded with highly toxic compounds. But the thought is that what's happening is when this is flying and a bird is chasing it, the bird sees these bright orange and black wings, and it's chasing that. The moth lands on a tree trunk, it folds its forewings over the hind wings, and that orange-black pattern vanishes. And instead you have a cryptic pattern that looks like bark. And so the bird is completely flummoxed and doesn't find the moth, so it doesn't eat it. That's the thinking anyway. Here's an arctiine, a famous one, Arachnus zuni. It's one of the most beautiful moths we have in southwestern New Mexico. And like a lot of arctiines, as I mentioned, mostly toxic, the abdomen is orange and black or red and black. This is a warning signal to birds that I am poisonous, don't mess with me. This one's about 2 inches across. It's a male. It's polyphagous. That means the larvae eat lots of different plants. Here's the underside, which is also strikingly beautiful. Different color pattern, but also quite striking. Here's another arctiine, Hypoprepia cadaverosa, smaller, 34 millimeters across. It's a male. It's probably poisonous given this incredibly bright orange color on the fore and hind wings and the abdomen. We don't know what the food plan is. Again, if we knew what the food plan is, we might be able to guess whether it was toxic or not. Appenthesis F. pallida. This is probably polyphagous. We're not sure all the food plants that this may eat. Again, striking orange and black on the hind wings and on the abdomen. So it's probably toxic. And then Tenuta crescenana, again, an arctiine. It's a male. Its larvae feed on grasses, and so it's probably not toxic because there are very, very few grasses that are actually toxic. It has a bright yellow on the head and the iridescent blue. The photograph doesn't show the iridescence, but the abdomen is iridescent blue. It's about 2 inches across. It's a beautiful moth when you see it live, flying from one flower to another. And then Actipia Cleo, 40 millimeters across, larval food plant, once again unknown, but a bright orange and black abdomen, so probably poisonous. And then Pseudohemihyalea ambigua, larval food plant unknown, not as strikingly colored, but it's in a family where so many moths are toxic, it's probably toxic as well. And then finally, Bertholdia trigona. This one I put in here because this little guy, 38 millimeters across, is the one who puts out 120 decibel signal in response to hearing a bat echolocation signal and blasts away so the bat can't find it. Pretty remarkable behavior. All right, so now we'll go to noctuity. This is the last group we're going to talk about. This is a big family, medium to large nocturnal moths, moth parts variable, triangular forewing. Here the tympanum is on the metathorax. And this is a highly diverse group, but I can give you some clues in terms of identification. So if you look at this photo here, One thing that will clue you into seeing a noctuid, is there's what's called the reniform spot and the orbicular spot, kidney-shaped spot and a round spot. If you see that on the forewing of a moth, you have a noctuid for sure. The problem is not all noctuids show this. For example, this one. So it's not a surefire thing, but if you see that, you know you have a noctuid. And they're economically important pests. There are lots of pests in here. Corn earworm, this is the adult of the corn earworm. You can see the reniform spot and the orbicular spot. There's the beet armyworm, tobacco budworm, and many others. So a lot of these are pests. So we know more about these. They're called cutworms, loopers, flower moths, and others. The cutworms are the group that are particularly damaging to agricultural species. So here's some examples. This one is a mouthful, Eucheiropterus gloveri. It's really a beautiful moth. It's one of our most beautiful noctuids. It feeds on members of the Portulaceae. But here, it's very clear you have a noctuid because here's the reniform spot, although it's not quite kidney-shaped, and here's the orbicular spot. It has bright orange coloring, but this family is not noted for having toxins in it, so probably this moth is not toxic. But it may fly during the day. It may be a diurnal moth, and it may be doing the same thing as the catocala. That is, when it lands, it covers these hind wings with the forewings, and this bright orange flag to the bird disappears. Here's a very beautiful moth, Hemibryomima chrysoselectra. It's about an inch across. Food plant is unknown, and this illustrates more features on the moth forewing. So here's the reniform spot, here's the orbicular spot. This is called the post-median line. This is the antemedian line. This is the basal line, and this is the terminal line. So if you see all of that, you know you have a noctuid. Sometimes there's a line comes through here that's called the median line, but this moth displays beautifully the terminal line, the post-median line, reniform orbicular spots, and a median line, and the basal line. The basal line is clearer on this side. All of that is a clear indication that you're looking at a noctuid. Now here's one that's really different, very beautiful. You can see the post-median line, and you can see the antemedian line. You can see the reniform spot, and you can see the orbicular spot. It's about 35 millimeters across. This is from my living quarters, outside my living quarters in the Big Burro Mountains. I think it's a very beautiful, it's one of the most beautiful noctuids I've ever seen. Now here's one that shows you that all rules are violated. This is a noctuid. You cannot see a reniform spot or an orbicular spot or a post-median line or an antemedian line or a basal line. You can see what looks like a terminal line or a subterminal line. Maybe this is a terminal line, this is a subterminal line, but all those other things that you would normally identify with a noctuid are missing here. So if you collected this, you would probably be confused for a while, and maybe eventually you figure out what it is because it is so striking in its appearance. We don't know what the larval food plant is. This one is a day flyer, Heliothus australis. Because it's a day flyer, it almost looks like a butterfly. Here's the orbicular spot, here's the reniform spot, here's the orbicular spot, here's the post-median line, and the antemedian line maybe here, and the basal line here. We don't know what this feeds on either, if I remember correctly. I caught this with a net. It was flying from flowers up in the area in the Gila wilderness. This one again does not look like a noctuid. None of those typical features are here. This is Heliocylus julia. This is a flower moth. Most of the flower moths are beautifully colored. You find them sitting on the flower head of the plant that's the larval food plant. But in this case, we don't know what the larval food plant is. And this was collected at night, so I don't know either. Here's Shinia jaguarina. The Shinia is a large genus of moths, all of which are really beautiful, all of which are flower moths. So this one It's a little bigger than an inch across, and it feeds on these legumes, Soralia, rhombifolia, and tenuifolia. Here you can see the post-median line and the antemedian line, but the reniform and orbicular spots are pretty much missing. Shinia gowri, extremely beautiful, I think. Again, it's lacking most of the typical features of the noctuid forewing. It feeds on Garo, which has now been put in Onothera, so this name is now somewhat misleading. But it's one of our prettier noctuids. And now we're done, except for web resources. Let me just give you a little guidance here. There's my website, Southwestern Moths, has moths of the Gila, a few moths from Texas, mostly moths from the Gila. There's over 600 species on here. There's also a list of everything that's on the website in case you want to, you have the name of a moth and you want to see whether I've found it or not in our area. There's also a links page, which gives you a bunch of useful links on the internet. And this is what the first page of that website looks like. There are over 30 pages. There's 20 photographs per page. And if you click on one of these, you'll get one of the pictures like the ones I've been showing you during this talk. The other big website is the Moth Photographers Group. This shows photographs of moths for the entirety of North America. So it's a very useful site. It has some quirks about it, but once you learn to use it, it's very useful. The main quirk that I would warn you about is it's set up so that you can look at various geographic areas in the United States. Don't do that. Use the open window for North America. The reason I say that is because the geographic data for moths is poor, and it's very poor for the Southwest. So if you narrow down the window to just look at moths of New Mexico or look at moths of Arizona or the Southwest, you're going to miss something that's probably here, but it's not noted geographically on the website. Also, if there's no geographic information for a particular species on this website and you set up a narrowed geographic window, you will not see the picture of that moth species. So I've been fooled by this a number of times. Bunk Guide is a general website for all insects, arthropods, centipedes, spiders. It's a very useful website. Once you register, you can put in pictures of things as an ID request, and people who are experts on this site will probably get back to you eventually and help you identify your organism. So highly recommended. Then for our area, especially southwestern New Mexico, Moths of Southeastern Arizona from Bruce Walsh at the University of Arizona. This is a very useful website. Some of the species that the photographs are pretty bad specimens, but still highly useful website. I recommend it. Finally, written resources. This book from the Lepidopterist Society, Basic Techniques for Observing and Studying Moths and Butterflies, is extremely useful, especially if you're trying to begin. It's a paperback. It's not terribly expensive. Highly recommended. There's a more technical volume for the Western US, Moths of Western North America, published by University of California Press. It's a wonderful book, but it's pretty technical, probably not a good place for beginners. And then if you're interested in moth biology, there's this wonderful paperback that just came out last year, Moths, A Complete Guide to Biology and Behavior. It's full of color pictures, full of fascinating moth stories and so forth. So lastly, I have to acknowledge that some of the slides here come from Dr. John Brown, who was formerly at the Systematic Entomology Laboratory at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And I thank him for the use of his slides. And I am done.